Good morning. I'm very happy to be here again to meet wonderful friends and colleagues and to learn. Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you very much, Anna. Diplomatic gifts have been part of international relations since ancient times. They can represent, among others, more or less noble motives of power and authority, friendship, request for help, apologies, bribes, and tricks. They were and still are political art. The material exchange of diplomatic gifts promoted the circulation of luxury goods in international contexts. This talk will examine Chinese porcelain as diplomatic gift in the early modern period, the Ming period in China from 1368 to 1644, the Renaissance in the Western world, and the early modern period in the Islamic empires of Mughal India, Safavid Iran, Ottoman Turkey, and Mamluk Egypt from the 13th to the 16th century. 3 case studies will be used. On the screen, a large Chinese vase painted in cobalt blue with a powerful and vibrant dragon. It was made in the reign of the Yongle emperor in the beginning of the 15th century, and probably given as a diplomatic gift to a Muslim ruler on the Southeast Asia archipelago, now Indonesia. The vase is preserved in the Princessehof collection, the Netherlands National Museum of Ceramics. These 2 fine Celadon pieces are diplomatic gifts from the Sultan of Egypt to the Medici in Italy. The vase, as well as the dish, have inscriptions on the base documenting the gift, which can be dated 1487. They are now preserved in the treasury of the Grand Duke, part of Palazzo Pitti in Florence. The third diplomatic gift I'm going to talk about are the originally 16 pieces of Chinese porcelain given in 1590 by the Medici as a diplomatic gift to the court of Saxony, Germany. The pieces of the gifts are documented in the Dresden Kunstkammer inventories, and they are preserved in the porcelain collection in Dresden, Germany. The dragon vase. From the times of the Chinese Yuan dynasties, this is the 13th, 14th century, the Mongol Empire, Chinese silk and Chinese porcelain were regarded as a global luxury commodity. Chinese porcelain was unique. No other culture could produce this mysterious and beautiful material. Chinese porcelain qualified in dealing with the Muslim courts in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. The spectacular Princessehof dragon vase was made in the early 15th century under the reign of the Yongle emperor. It is, rare, beautiful, and priceless, and very probably was a diplomatic gift. The vase was acquired by Nane Ottoma. He lived from 1874 to 1955, and he was the founder and the lifelong director of this Princessehof Museum in Leeuwarden, the Netherlands. He had discovered it in a small antique shop in Rotterdam in the year 1935. Together with his vase, Ottoma got the information that the vase was originally found on the Sangir Islands in Indonesia. This refers to a group of 77 volcanic islands stretching north of Sulawesi into the direction of the Philippines. How did this piece of porcelain, of which only 4 comparable pieces are known, preserved in the palace collections in Beijing and Taipei, travel from China to Indonesia and finally to the small town of Leeuwarden in Friesland, the Netherlands, of all places? To find out, we first have to go back to the early Ming dynasty in China, when this vase was made in the imperial kilns in Zhushan in Jingdezhen, and explore how this precious vessel traveled from China to the Sangir Islands. The Yongle emperor was the son of the founder of the Ming dynasty and a ruler of Shakespearean dimensions, haunted by traumata, but this is another story. In 1403, he made himself emperor, choosing the reign title of Yongle, meaning perpetual happiness. See the official portrait preserved in the Palace Museum in Taipei. In 1405, the emperor sent out his trusted admiral Zheng He to command a gigantic fleet of ships on the legendary Seven Sea Voyages to the far borders of the known world. The mission was to overwhelm foreign people and to convince them of the power of the Ming dynasty, the dynasty of the great brightness, and of the glorious, legitimate Yongle emperor. The more than 2,000 vessels were around 140 meters long. La Santa Maria, biggest of the 3 ships of Christopher Columbus, had a length of about 18 meters. Between 1405 and 33, Zheng He commanded these 7 sea voyages, and see on the screen a sea map Zheng He used. And being a Muslim himself, facilitated the acceptance in the many Muslim-controlled ports. The voyages, with hundreds of ships, sailed to Southeast Asia, to India, Sri Lanka, and the African coast, to the Red Sea, and even close to Mecca and Medina. Several voyages to what is now Indonesia are recorded. Most of the diplomatic gifts Zheng He presented to the foreign rulers were probably silk and porcelain, representing the superior and most prestigious products of China. It is therefore highly possible that the dragon vase, now in the Princessehof collection, was one of the diplomatic gifts Zheng He carried in the early 15th century to one of the Muslim rulers of the Indonesian archipelago. And in the early 20th century, when Indonesia was under Dutch colonial rule, this vase was somehow acquired there and brought to the Rotterdam antique shop. There it was discovered by Nanne Ottemo and subsequently added to the collection of the Princessehof. I think it's a really spectacular global biography of a Chinese blue and white vase. On the screen, a detail from a painting. The whole hand scroll is about 6 meters long, of foreign delegations at the Ming court carrying tributes, carrying diplomatic gifts. Diplomatic gifts in traditional China were not an exchange between equal partners. The founder of the Ming dynasty had re-established the idealized traditional tribute system. A foreign country wishing to obtain goods from China had to send a delegation to the Chinese court bringing gifts or tributes. Politically, this was interpreted as the acceptance of China as central state, 中国, and the Chinese emperor as the son of heaven, the legitimate ruler of the universe, 天下, all under the heaven. Only then the Chinese emperor would answer with his own gifts. The goods the Chinese presented to rulers of the foreign countries were to show the superiority of Chinese workmanship, representing the empire and the emperor. By the exchange of tribute to the foreign party was considered an ally, which could be supported with certain benefits, like military aid or trade agreements. In this traditional Chinese concept, to trade for goods with foreign countries was simply not necessary. Ideally, all sides benefited and peace was assured, but this was a theory. In reality, there was, of course, always a trade going on an enormous scale. In the exchange of diplomatic gifts, therefore, there were not only the gifts from the Chinese emperor, but also these tributes given to him. One of the most spectacular gifts, this Zheng He, this admiral, brought back from his voyages was a giraffe we see on the screen. This is a painting from around 1420, now at the Philadelphia Museum. The giraffe originally was a diplomatic gift of an African king, the ruler of Malindi, now Kenya, to the king of Bengal, India. And when this Bengal king paid homage at the Ming court at Nanjing, the Chinese capital, he brought the giraffe with him as a gift to the Yongle emperor. The Chinese, of course, had never seen a giraffe before, so they interpreted the giraffe as being one of the most auspicious mythical animals in China, a qilin. And this is then the title of this painting. For the 15th and 16th centuries, the courts of Central Asia, like the Timurids and the Mughal court in India, together with the Persian and the Ottomans and Egyptian rulers, were the most important clients for Chinese porcelain. Chinese porcelain was used for status display as diplomatic gift, but mainly for banquets. On the screen, a miniature dated end of the 16th century, and it shows the Mughal Emperor Akbar receiving Persian ambassadors who are presenting him with valuable diplomatic gifts. The ruler on the right side on a throne. On the left, we see the preparations for the banquet. Large Chinese dishes of celadon and blue and white porcelain, some with gold and silver covers, have been placed on a red carpet. The still empty blue and white dish here must have been of an enormous size. Today, more than 20,000 pieces of mostly blue and white and celadons are preserved in the collection of the Topkapi Saray in Istanbul. With around 1,350 pieces, the number of Chinese celadon is enormous. A huge percentage of these pieces preserved are large serving dishes. The Ottoman rulers were using Chinese porcelain as luxury tableware. We know from descriptions that at some formal banquets, more than 800 pieces of celadon were used. Food at ceremonial banquets at the Topkapi was mostly served on these large celadon serving dishes, suiting Muslim communal eating habits. The Chinese had no use for these large dishes, you know. Besides the green color, green symbolizing Islam, of course, celadon was believed to crack or sweat if poisonous food was placed on it. It is a nightmare of every ruler, of course, and so making this type of ceramic even more valued. See on the screen a miniature which depicts the reception of the Polish ambassador at the Ottoman court, Topkapi Sarai, in 1677. The banquet served on large Chinese dishes. It was then via the countries of the Middle East that Chinese porcelain came to Europe, especially to Italy. Italian merchants had a vigorous trade with the Ottoman Empire, Persia, Egypt, and Syria. And Venice, as a cosmopolitan eastern city, played a key role in this trade. It was also from this city that Marco Polo set out to the Far East in 1271. On the screen, a detail of a magnificent painting now in the Bodleian libraries in Oxford. It illustrates the opening of Marco Polo's travels and shows Marco and his brother and his father and his uncle on the brink of their departure from Venice, bound for China, the Mongol Empire of the Yuan. During his stay in China, Marco Polo had seen near the port of Quanzhou in Fujian white glazed porcelain or Chinese ceramics in this. In his travel accounts, he referred to it as porcellane, a word used in Italian for cowrie shells. And probably because these shells resembled the whitish pink color and hunched back of small piglets, the Italians called these shells porcellos, a diminutive of porco, pig. So it was Venice, the capital of exotic luxury goods in the 15th century, where Chinese porcelain was highly appreciated. This is represented in two important paintings: Mantegna's Adoration of the Magi and Bellini's Feast of the Gods. Obviously, Chinese porcelain was seen as an appropriate gift from the Magi to the Christ child and for the antique gods and goddesses to feast from. We see on the screen the late painting by Andrea Mantegna, The Adoration, dated around 1500, this version in the Getty Museum. The gift of the first wise man is a blue and white cup filled with pieces of gold. The decoration with lotus scrolls indicates that this could well be a fine 15th century porcelain cup. A detail from the famous Feast of the Gods by Giovanni Bellini and Titian from the National Gallery in Washington, dated 1514. The Greek gods and goddesses are feasting and dining from food served on Chinese blue and white porcelain. The blue and white bowls with their decorations of lotus scrolls are again those of 15th century Chinese porcelain. And these two paintings are in fact the earliest depiction of Chinese porcelain in European painting. From the detailed precision with which Giovanni Bellini painted these exotic Chinese porcelain in his Feast of the Gods, it is obvious that he had actually seen the real thing. Venice in the 14th century, 15th century was still an important trading center. And it would indeed not have been difficult for Bellini to have access to Chinese porcelain preserved at the Doge's Palace in Venice. Chinese porcelain reached the Doges and other prominent figures of Venice in numbers as diplomatic gifts from Muslim rulers of the Middle East. In 1461, for instance, the Doge Pasquale Malipiero of Venice received 20 pieces of Chinese porcelain as a gift from the Egyptian Sultan Abul Farhamir. Bellini painted the portraits of several Doges, and on the screen the portrait of Leonardo Loredan in his ceremonial garments, dated 1500, National Gallery, London. Bellini therefore certainly must have access to the palace in Venice. And there was trade between the Muslim rulers of the Middle East with Italy, and there was an exchange of diplomatic gifts. Why diplomatic gifts? The 15th and 16th centuries were glorious times for Venice, and the trading between the countries of the Middle East and Venice is serenissima. On the screen, a painting, Anonymous, dated Venice 1511, now in the Louvre in Paris. It's showing the reception of the Venetian ambassadors in Damascus. Full of wonders, I think, wonderful with all these animals around it. Yeah. Let me say something about the concept of diplomatic gifts in the Muslim world, very different from the traditional Chinese idea. Gifts, munificence, was not so much a personal predilection, but a fundamental expression of magnificence. To give and to receive were the very essence of privilege. Gifts were more than manifestations of power and success. They were duties. This applied not only to the Muslim rulers, be it Persian, Ottoman, or Mughal, but to all members of the elite. A gift was more than an issue of honor and value. The extrinsic value of the gift lay in its recognitions or conferral of status, and offense could be caused if the gift did not meet the standard expected. Protocol had to be observed. At many occasions, it was not understood by the Middle East rulers or aristocracy that the Italians or French were making great demands without bringing the smallest presents themselves, not even a watch or a basket of fruit. We are now in Florence, and on the screen the fresco by Giorgio Vasari in the Palazzo Vecchio, Florence. It's showing Lorenzo il Magnifico, we heard about him yesterday, seated among philosophers and scholars, framed by the allegories of fame and virtue. It was Florence where the Medici emerged as the earliest actual collectors of Chinese porcelain in Europe. It is recorded that in the collection of Lorenzo il Magnifico, he lived 1449 to 92, were 51 pieces of porcelain, Chinese porcelain. Most of it had come into the collection as diplomatic gift. An example is the gift of some 20 pieces of Chinese porcelain given in the year 1487 by the Egyptian Sultan Al-Ashraf Qaitbay to win the support of the Medici. We see on the screen part of the gift still preserved at the treasury in the Palazzo Pitti. A large celadon vase, which could well be dated into the 14th century, late Yuan or early Ming, and a large celadon dish of about the same period. The large celadon dish has an inscription on the base which reads, Cois bei d'Egitto mando da finimento da terra d'Egitto a Lorenzo il Magnifico. The Sultan of Egypt sent this from the Egypt to Lorenzo il Magnifico to embellish the diplomatic relations. The Medici, particularly Lorenzo il Magnifico, had made Florence the center of an international diplomatic network. On the screen, another famous fresco by Giorgio Vasari, dated around 1556, also Palazzo Vecchio. It shows ambassadors paying homage to Lorenzo di Medici. Prominent in Vasari's painting is, of course, Lorenzo, but among all these ambassadors documenting the glory of the Medici, surprise, surprise, a giraffe. I have to admit that only when I was working on this talk, I realized that there was not only a giraffe brought as a diplomatic gift to China in the early 15th century, together with Zheng He, but voila, the very famous Medici giraffe, made immortal in a number of paintings. But let's have a look again at the painting of the poor giraffe, which came to Nanjing around 1420, after traveling from Africa to India and from India to the Chinese court, some 50 years before the Medici giraffe entered Florence as a diplomatic gift. On the right, an anonymous engraving of the Medici giraffe. The Medici giraffe was a very spectacular, exotic diplomatic gift, and you will find numbers of articles written about this giraffe. Allow me a few comments. This Medici giraffe actually used to walk around freely in Florence and looked into the first floor apartments of people's houses when they had dinner or whatever. But the poor animal died, as a legend has it, having hit his head on a low-hanging beam in its luxury winterized Florence house. And well, coming back to Chinese porcelain, the Medici giraffe very probably came together with the Chinese Celadon pieces I just showed you, from the Egyptian Sultan to Lorenzo il Magnifico. We know that the Egyptian Sultan had a menagerie. He had appealed to Lorenzo for help against the Ottomans around the time of the Celadons and the giraffe's arrival in Florence. And the diplomatic gift seemed to have worked. Not long afterwards, Lorenzo gave support to the Egypt ruler. The giraffe, as we have heard, died very shortly in the winter after arrival in Florence, but became immortal because it was depicted not only together with Lorenzo, but also by a number of other rather famous Renaissance artists. It was 1488, 1 year after arrival in Florence, that Domenico Ghirlandaio inserted the giraffe into his fresco The Adoration of the Magi for the Tornabuoni family chapel in Santa Maria Novella. You see it up in the right corner. And in 1511, Andrea del Sarto painted the fresco for Santissima Annunziata in Florence, again an adoration, with a giraffe bobbing high on the hill on the right, beside the rock. Indeed, I'm sorry to mention it, but it was giraffes, not Chinese porcelain, which seemed to be a most sought-after luxury and diplomatic good. We know that in 1584, Caterina de' Medici asked the Ottoman court to provide her, please, with Abyssinian slaves, an elephant, and a giraffe. Apologies for these deviations into a different field, but we are now back very seriously to the Medici and Chinese porcelain. In the 16th century, it was Cosimo I and his son Francesco I who excelled as art collectors and collectors of porcelain. In 1553, the inventory of the collections of Cosimo counts more than 400 pieces of porcellana. One of the successors of Cosimo was Cardinale Ferdinando de Medici, 1549 to 1609, his portrait as a cardinal on the screen, right-hand side. He was a very passionate collector of porcelain, documented by inventories preserved. And not just porcelain, Ferdinando Medici was the greatest collector of his time. His famous collections of Greek and Roman sculpture, bronzes, paintings were housed in the Villa Medici in Rome. And in the year 1587, Ferdinando became Grand Duke of Tuscany and moved his collections from Rome to Florence. And his art was then housed in the Palazzo Pitti. Based on the inventories preserved, it seems that he passionately collected ceramics, including Chinese porcelain. It has to be mentioned, however, that it is sometimes difficult to decide if the porcellana mentioned in the inventories and lists refers to Italian majolica, Islamic fritware, or Chinese porcelain. But it seems there were numerous pieces of Chinese porcelain, for in October 1571, Ferdinando gave 80 pieces of porcellana dell'India, porcelain from India, to his sister Isabella. India in this period is referring rather vaguely to the Far East, and these pieces were therefore very probably Chinese porcelain. The collection of Chinese porcelain of Ferdinando seemed to have grown to more than 500 pieces by 1590, and 1590 is a year exactly February 26, when Ferdinando gave Chinese porcelain to Christian I, Elector of Saxony in Germany, his portrait on the left. It was a most fragile diplomatic mission, a long journey from Florence over the Alps to the north to faraway Dresden in Germany. Let us take a look at the situation in Dresden in the 16th century. The Saxonian electors of the 16th century wished to turn Dresden into a princely city and to establish themselves as rulers of European importance. This meant modernization in the cultural field, and modernization meant Italianization. In 1586, Christian I had become the elector to rule only a short period, but as a great collector, his ambition was to enlarge the Dresden Kunstkammer, the treasury, to give it European importance. And the Medici were interested in having good relationship with those German princes and rulers who could provide them with both skilled mining and artillery specialists, and with political support. In the year 1585, when Christian became ruler in Saxony, the Medici therefore sent 3 works of the famous sculptor Giovanni di Bologna from Florence. One of Giambologna's masterpieces, the figure of the messenger of the gods, Mercurius, or Mercury, dated 1586, is still one of the artistic highlights of the green walls, the Dresden Kunstkammer, the treasury. And in 1590, the earlier mentioned important diplomatic gift from the Medici arrived at the Dresden court, Chinese porcelain. There is a register of the gifts written at the Medici court in Florence and still preserved today. We know from these registers that actually 3 boxes were packed for the diplomatic mission. One, again, with bronzes, sculptures and paintings. One with Chinese porcelain, and an extra box containing wonderful things, typical Italian gourmet food. Let me whet your appetite by mentioning only a few of them. In this box, there was Parmesan cheese, there was olio dolce, sweet oil, there were different kinds of prosciutto, special ham, salami, there were salted geese, whatever this was, and of course, to swallow this more pleasantly, Italian wine, Greek wine 48 years old, and Sicilian wine Trebbiano. On the screen now on the left, the cover of the Dresden Kunstkammer inventory, 1595, still preserved in the archives. And on the right, the list the Medici gift of Chinese porcelain. It reads, I quote, an italienischen Trink- und anderen Geschirren, welche anno 1590 von den Herzogen von Florenz verehrte worden. Italian drinking vessels and other vessels which were given in the year 1590 by the Duke of Florence. And the register of the gifts includes 14 Chinese porcelains and objects made of gold and silver. Most of the Chinese porcelains are not specifically referred to, as the register just says una scodella di porcellana, one porcelain bowl. However, comparing the packing lists from the Florence and the Dresden inventories, it is not difficult to identify individual pieces. This is this group of 8 pieces which are preserved and on display now at the porcelain collection in Dresden. They represent a most remarkable ensemble. Some of the first mysterious Chinese porcelains which made their way over the Alps to the north. We see from the left to the right 2 so-called Kinrande bowls, green and red glazed with gold decorations on the exterior. Then a most interesting small ewer in the shape of a crayfish, an ewer in the shape of a phoenix, spectacular, 2 blue and white bowls, and on the right a blue and white lidded bowl. A strangely shaped object is a small lantern in the foreground, in the shape of a boat painted in green and yellow with the figure of the Chinese god Guixing standing on it. The ewer in the shape of a phoenix is really spectacular. It seems that the Dresden scribe was quite understandably not very familiar with a Chinese phoenix. So he mistook it as a dragon and listed his vessel as, I quote, a porcelain jug in the shape of a dragon with gold and colors added. The interesting little crayfish-shaped vessel, only about 10 centimeters high, is a bizarre type of vessel which during the early modern period traveled from southern China, where it was made around the globe. It is, as some of you might know, one of my pet pieces. I did a lot of research on where he stopped his travels, this type. He was used actually in Indonesia, on Borneo, to drink alcohol when the indigenous people there came together before headhunting. And it is in a couple of Kunstkammer collections in Europe, so a very global and strange fate. The descriptions of the Medici collection from the year 1579 says, una peparola di porcellana a moda di gambero dorato, a vessel for pepper made of porcelain in the shape of a crayfish with gold. The term peparola, which means something like a small pepper pot, seems quite surprising. We would think that the vessel was used to pour water, kind of pure. But obviously, the Medici put pepper, at that time quite an exotic and very expensive commodity, into the opening at the back and poured it from the opening at the mouth of the crayfish. This is not so surprising, as we know that the Medici kept porcelain objects, also Chinese porcelain objects, not only as collector's items or for display, but actually used it at the table. These three case studies are only one aspect of the history of Chinese porcelain as a global luxury good in the early modern period. And more research will not only enrich our knowledge on the history of Chinese porcelain, but the history of global trade, of the exchange of diplomatic gifts, which is so familiar today. And let me quote John Carswell from his wonderful book, Blue and White, Chinese Porcelain Around the World. I quote, "I can think of no other commodities that can so perfectly illustrate the complexity of human relations in the past and the interaction of civilizations at the opposite ends of Asia and indeed around the world." Thank you very much.